He crawled out of the Montana wilderness with frostbitten hands, an empty gun, and 3 days of failure carved into his face. She was alone in the frozen highlands with a cast-iron skillet, a stubborn streak, and no intention of letting anyone tell her what she was worth. Neither of them was looking for the other. Neither of them had any business surviving what came next. But when a half-dead deputy stumbled into a stranger's camp and smelled something cooking in the cold, everything changed. If you want to know how two broken people built something that outlasted them both, stay with me until the end. Hit like, follow the channel, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came first. Before the hunger, before the exhaustion, before the slow and humiliating realization that he had lost his man entirely, the cold arrived and settled into Colter Reed's bones like something with intention. Like it had chosen him specifically. Like it had been following him through these mountains for the past 3 days and had finally caught up. He was somewhere above 6,000 feet. He knew that because the air had the thin, biting quality that made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass, and because the spruce trees had thinned out enough that he could see the white expanse of the ridge above him, the kind of white that had no depth to it, no shadow, just an endless pale nothing stretching toward a sky the color of old pewter. He stopped walking. That was a mistake, and he knew it, even as he did it, because stopping meant the wind caught him, and the wind in the Montana highlands in November was not something you negotiated with. It moved through his coat like the coat wasn't there. His fingers, inside 2 pairs of wool gloves, had stopped feeling like fingers about an hour ago and had started feeling like wooden dowels attached to his palms. Colter Reed, deputy marshal out of Helena, 34 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of stubbornness on a good day, stood on a frozen mountainside and admitted to himself that he was in real trouble. The man he'd been tracking, a horse thief and probable murderer named Denny Falk, had disappeared somewhere in these mountains 2 days ago. Colter had followed his trail through 2 valleys, over 1 pass, and into a stretch of highland country that seemed designed specifically to break anyone foolish enough to enter it in winter. He'd lost the tracks when the snow came down hard on the second night. He'd been moving on instinct and stubbornness since then, telling himself that Falk had to come down sometime, had to make for shelter, had to show himself. But Falk hadn't, or if he had, Colter had missed it. And now he was standing on the side of a mountain with maybe 4 hours of gray light left in the sky, half a biscuit in his coat pocket, and the creeping certainty that if he didn't find something, shelter, fire, water, anything, he was going to become another winter statistic in a territory that collected them with grim efficiency. He pulled his coat tighter, looked north, looked south. The landscape offered nothing back but its usual indifference. Then he smelled it. Wood smoke, faint and sweet, coming from somewhere below him and to the east. His head turned before his brain caught up. Some older and more animal part of him recognized it immediately. Fire, warmth, life. And he was moving again before he'd made any conscious decision to do so. He half walked and half slid down the slope, grabbing at spruce branches to keep himself upright, his frozen boots catching on rocks hidden under the snow. The smell got stronger. Wood smoke and something else now. Something that made his stomach seize up and his mouth go wet despite his chapped lips, despite everything. Something cooking. Actual food, hot and savory, not the jerky he'd run out of yesterday morning or the half-frozen biscuit in his pocket. He came around the base of a boulder field and stopped. The camp was tucked into a natural hollow in the hillside, sheltered on 3 sides by rock and dense spruce growth. It was a good camp. Better than good, actually. It was the kind of camp that someone knew how to make. A canvas lean-to stretched tight between 2 trees, angled to cut the wind. A fire built properly in a ring of stones, not too large, controlled, with a flat cooking rock set close to the heat and a small iron pot suspended above the flames. A pack mule stood tied to a picket line between 2 spruces, blanketed and fed, its breath making small clouds in the cold air. Near the fire, hanging from a line strung between trees, were 3 rabbits, gutted and cleaned, their skins stiff with cold. And sitting on a folded blanket next to the fire, slicing something on a small wooden board with the kind of concentration that people usually reserve for tasks that actually mattered, was a woman. She heard him before he said anything. She looked up, and her right hand moved. Not to a weapon, he noticed, though there was a rifle leaning against the tree behind her, but rather to a stillness. The kind of stillness that meant she'd been startled and wasn't going to let him see it. You walk like a drunk horse, she said. I heard you coming down that slope for about 2 minutes. Her voice was flat and direct. Not unfriendly exactly, but not offering anything either. She was somewhere in her late 20s, dark-haired, round-faced, with a thick wool coat that had seen better days and boots that looked like they'd walked a considerable number of miles. She wasn't beautiful in the way that got women written about in newspapers, but she had a quality to her face that Coulter would later struggle to name, a kind of held ground, like she'd decided a long time ago exactly where she stood and nothing had moved her since. She looked at him the way people look at something they're trying to assess quickly, not frightened, not welcoming, assessing. You look half dead, she said. I've been better, Coulter admitted. You a marshal or something? She nodded at his coat, where his badge was pinned. Deputy, out of Helena. What are you doing up here? Tracking a man. Lost him. He paused. Lost myself a little, too. She looked at him for another long moment. He could see her making some kind of calculation. The thing people did when a stranger showed up and they had to decide, fast, what kind of stranger they were looking at. He'd done the same calculation himself 1,000 times from the other side of it. Come sit down before you fall down, she said, finally. You're making me cold just looking at you. He crossed the camp and sat on a log near the fire, and the heat hit him like something physical. He hadn't realized how completely frozen he'd become until the warmth started working on his face and hands, and the sensation that came back wasn't comfort. It was pain, the pins and needles burn of circulation returning to tissue that had been on the edge. He pressed his hands together and bent his fingers carefully, checking them. How long have your hands been like that? She asked, not looking up from what she was cutting. Few hours. Can you feel your feet? Some. Take your boots off. Ma'am, take them off. If your feet are frostbitten, you need to know now, not in an hour when it's worse. She finally looked up. I'm not asking because I'm interested in your feet. I'm asking because if they're bad, you'll lose them, and a deputy with no feet isn't much use to anyone. He took his boots off. His socks were damp. His feet were pale and numb on the outer toes. She came over, crouched down without ceremony, and pressed 2 fingers against his smallest toe on the left foot. He felt nothing. You're not far gone, she said, standing, but you're close. Keep them near the fire. Don't rub them. That makes it worse. She went back to her cooking board. I'm Tessa Crow. Coulter Reed. You eaten today, Coulter Reed? Half a biscuit, about noon. She said nothing to that, just turned back to the fire and began doing things with quick, practiced movements that he found himself watching the way you watch someone who clearly knows what they're doing, with a kind of involuntary attention. She added something to the pot, adjusted it, tasted from a small spoon, frowned slightly, added something else. The smell intensified and his stomach made a sound that he hoped the wind covered. It didn't. There's about an hour left in that stew, she said, not looking at him. You can have some. I don't want to take your food. I've got 3 rabbits and enough root vegetables to last another 4 days. 1 bowl isn't going to ruin me. She paused. Don't argue about it. It makes me tired. He didn't argue. What? The stew was rabbit and dried onion, and something she'd done with sage and dried pepper that he couldn't entirely account for. It was the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he could immediately remember, and not in the vague, nostalgic way people say things are good. It was specifically, concretely good, the kind of food that made the cold feel further away and the firelight feel warmer than it actually was. He ate slowly because she'd told him to, that eating too fast after cold and deprivation made a man sick, and she'd said it the way she said most things, which was as a fact rather than a suggestion. He watched her work while he ate. She moved around the camp with an efficiency that was striking. Not rushing, not wasting anything, each motion connected to the next like she had a map of what needed to happen and was simply following it. She added wood to the fire at the right intervals to keep it burning steady. She covered the remaining stew and set it away from the direct heat. She checked the mule, adjusted the blanket, checked the picket line. Where are you headed? He asked. Bozeman. She sat back down on her folded blanket. Eventually, if the passes don't close. You're traveling alone? Evidently. That's... He stopped himself. Dangerous? Her voice was level. You were going to say dangerous. I was going to say uncommon. It's uncommon because most people think it's dangerous. She looked at him steadily. I've been traveling alone for 6 years. I'm still here. He nodded. He believed her. She had the quality of someone who'd earned every opinion she held through direct experience, and he didn't imagine many of those opinions were interested in being argued with. What's in Bozeman? He asked. Work. She said it simply. The Silvercrest Hotel is looking for kitchen staff. I'm not looking to be kitchen staff. I'm looking to run the kitchen. A slight pause. They don't know that yet. You're a cook. I'm a chef. The distinction was quiet but firm. There's a difference. He thought about asking what the difference was, then decided it was probably the kind of question that would tell her more about his ignorance than he wanted her to know just yet. Instead, he looked at the pot, at the easy precision with which she'd worked, and thought that he understood the distinction reasonably well without needing it explained. What made you decide on Bozeman? He asked. Heard it's growing fast. New money, new people with appetites they want satisfied. A town growing that quick needs someone who knows what they're doing in a kitchen, and eventually someone smart enough is going to figure out that what they want is someone who actually knows food, not just someone who can boil it. She added a stick to the fire. I'm planning to be there when they figure that out. That's a confident plan. It's an honest plan. She glanced at him. Confidence and honesty aren't the same thing. I'm not confident it'll work. I'm honest that it's what I'm going to try. The wind picked up outside the hollow. The fire bent and steadied. Coulter looked at the sky visible above the tree line and didn't like what he saw. Storm coming, he said. By morning, she agreed. I've been watching it since noon. It's going to be a bad one. The way the clouds are building out of the northwest, and the temperatures dropped 7, maybe 8 degrees in the last 2 hours. She looked at the lean-to. I made the shelter stronger this afternoon. You were expecting it. I was preparing for it. That's different. She looked at him. You're not going anywhere tonight. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an offer, exactly. It was just the way it was. No, he said. I suppose I'm not. The storm arrived at 3 in the morning with a sound like the world rearranging itself. Coulter woke from a half-sleep to the roar of wind over the hollow and the hiss of snow driving hard against the canvas of the lean-to. He lay still for a moment, listening, taking inventory of what he felt, warmer than he'd been in days, his hands and feet aching in a way that meant blood was moving through them properly, his stomach not empty for the first time since Tuesday. He looked across the fire, which had burned down to deep orange coals. Tessa was sitting up, awake, adding wood carefully to bring the flames back. She moved quietly, not trying to wake him, not needing to. How bad? He asked. She didn't startle, just glanced over. Bad. Could run 2 days. He sat up. 2 days. Maybe 3. She set another piece of wood on the fire. There's nothing to do about it, so there's no point in thinking about it except to make sure we have enough fuel and food to wait it out. He thought about Falk, thought about the tracks, buried now under however many inches of new snow. Thought about the entire futile geometry of the past 3 days. My fugitive's gone, he said. Probably. She wasn't unkind about it, just honest. Either he found shelter before this hit, or he didn't. Either way, there's no tracking him through this. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I know. She handed him a tin cup of something hot. Not coffee, some kind of pine needle tea that tasted sharp and medicinal but warmed his chest. He took it without comment. Tell me about the man you were tracking, she said. He looked at her. You're awake. I'm awake. There's nothing else to do. And you have that look that men get when they're carrying something that's gotten heavier than they expected. She poured her own cup. You don't have to. But if you're going to be in my camp for 3 days, I'd rather know who I'm sharing it with. He told her. Not everything. He wasn't the kind of man who told everything quickly, but the shape of it. Denny Falk, suspected of killing a homesteader over a land dispute, definitely guilty of stealing 3 horses and leading a chase through 4 counties. The case had been running for 6 weeks. The sheriff had sent Coulter because Coulter was supposed to be good at this kind of thing. And are you? She asked. Good at this kind of thing? I used to think so. What changed your mind? Not catching him. He drank the tea. 3 weeks in the field, 6 counties, nothing. One man running is hard to catch, she said. Even a man who isn't smart, if he keeps moving and stays scared, can outrun someone chasing him. The chase is always harder than it looks. You sound like you know something about it. I know something about being chased. She said it simply, looking at the fire. Not by lawmen, by other things. A pause. By other people's ideas of what you're supposed to be. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't, not then. But he'd caught the edge of something in her voice. Not bitterness, exactly, but something that had come from a long way back and hadn't fully let go yet. The fire built up slowly. Outside, the storm hammered the world flat. He learned things about her over the next 2 days, the way you learn things about people in close quarters when there's nothing else to do. Not all at once, not through any single conversation, but in pieces, through what she said and what she didn't say, and how she moved through the hours. She was from a small town in eastern Wyoming, though she didn't offer the name of it, and he didn't ask. She'd started cooking in a hotel kitchen at 15, working as a prep hand under a head cook who'd recognized something in her ability early and pushed her toward it, and then died when she was 17, leaving her with a set of skills and no one willing to see them in a girl who wasn't particularly decorative by the standards most people applied. Decorative, Coulter repeated. That's what they wanted. She was making a flat bread of some kind over the fire, her movements precise and unhurried. A pretty girl behind the counter draws customers. A plain girl who can actually cook makes them uncomfortable, because if she's good at her job, then they have to take her seriously, and most men in most kitchens don't especially want to do that. You're not plain, he said. She looked at him with a flat, patient expression that communicated, without any particular hostility, that she had heard variations of that sentence before, and that it wasn't the point. That's kind of you, she said, but it's also exactly the kind of answer that proves what I'm saying. My worth in a kitchen was always attached to something that had nothing to do with the food. She turned the bread. I spent 10 years in kitchens I was overqualified for, watching men with half my ability get promoted over me because they were men with half my ability. I watched owners hire sweet young girls to hand out plates while I did the actual work in the back. She paused. Then I got tired of watching and decided to find somewhere that might be different. Bozeman. Bozeman. She glanced up. Or somewhere past it if Bozeman doesn't work. There's always somewhere past. He'd thought about that phrase later, lying in the dark while the storm pressed against the canvas. There's always somewhere past. It was the kind of thing that sounded like hope, but had the texture of something harder, something that had been worn smooth by use, by necessity, by a long habit of pushing forward because the alternative was stopping. She asked him about himself in a way that was careful but genuine, not pressing, but actually interested, which he found more disarming than he expected. He told her he'd grown up in Nebraska, come west at 22 looking for something he hadn't been able to name, drifted into law work because he was good with people and not afraid of confrontation, and there was always need for men like that in the territories. You like it? She asked. The law work? Parts of it. Which parts? He thought about it honestly because she seemed like someone who'd notice if he didn't. I like when I can see clearly what's right and wrong, and the job is to stand between them. I'm less comfortable with the parts where it's not clear. He paused. Those parts are most of it. That's honest. You asked an honest question. She smiled at that. A small, real smile. Not the performed kind. It changed her face briefly, and then it was gone, and she was back to tending the fire with that same concentrated efficiency. But he'd seen it, and it stayed with him. The storm broke on the second afternoon. They spent the following morning digging out the mule and breaking down the camp, and Coulter helped because it was the right thing to do, and because she didn't ask him to. She simply began working, and he fell in alongside her, and that seemed to satisfy some unspoken principle that she held about not accepting charity, but not refusing actual help. While they worked, she said, "The pass ahead, do you know it?" Vaguely. The north route is shorter, but it'll be drifted past any reasonable crossing for at least a week after a storm like that. She looked at the mountains to the west. There's a lower route that goes through Garrison Creek drainage. Takes a day longer, but it'll be passable. You know this country? I've been through twice before, coming and going. She tied a pack rope with quick, sure movements. I mapped the route on my last crossing. I have notes. He realized she'd been here before, had learned the country the same way she'd learned everything else. Through direct contact, paying attention, writing it down. He thought about the 3 days he'd spent floundering through these mountains and felt something that was close to embarrassed, though not quite. "I'll come with you," he said. "To Bozeman, if you'll have the company." She looked at him across the mule's back. "You've lost your fugitive." "I've lost my fugitive." "And you need a way through the mountains that won't kill you." "I need a way through the mountains," he agreed. "Though I'd have found one. Eventually." The smallest possible degree of dryness in her voice. "All right, you can come. You'll carry your share of the load and you won't complain about the route." "Agreed. And you won't tell me what I should do about Bozeman or the Silver Crest or any of it. You can listen if I talk about it. But unsolicited advice from men on the subject of how a woman should pursue her ambitions is something I've had enough of to last several lifetimes." "Understood." She turned back to the pack rope. "Good. Then let's move." Ciao. The journey through the Garrison Creek drainage took 3 days, and they were 3 of the hardest days Coulter could remember in a life that had not been short on hard days. The snow was deep in the lower country, knee-high in the open stretches, thigh-high in the drifts along the creek banks. The mule, a steady creature named Frank, whom Tessa spoke to in a low, matter-of-fact voice as if they had a long-standing professional arrangement, pushed through it with stubborn patience. They each took turns breaking trail when the going got bad, though Tessa's turns were longer than his because she was better at reading the terrain. She was better at it than him. He figured that out on the first day and stopped trying to pretend otherwise. "You're second-guessing me," she said, on the afternoon of the first day. They were picking their way along the base of a snow-laden slope, and he'd angled slightly left toward what looked like a more direct line. "Just looking at the route," he said. "The route I've been looking at for the last 6 hours goes along the rock band, not through the open slope." She stopped. "That slope is loaded. See the cornice up top? The snow above is sitting on a crust from the rain freeze 2 weeks ago. If anything sets it off, and we would, it comes down fast and it buries everything." He looked. He hadn't seen it. He looked at it again, and now that she'd described it, he could see exactly what she meant. The way the snow was piled, the subtle convexity of the cornice above, the particular quality of the light on the face. "Avalanche," he said. "Yes. Simple, not triumphant. Stay on the rock band." They stayed on the rock band. On the second day, they crossed a frozen river crossing that required 50 yards of ice travel with the mule, and she went across first to test the ice, moving carefully, testing each step before she waved him across. He brought Frank across with his heart in his throat, the ice groaning underneath, and when they reached the far bank, she had a rope loop ready to help control the animal on the final stretch. "You've done that before," he said. "Many times." She coiled the rope back. "The trick is not to rush. Ice doesn't care about your schedule." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it doesn't." He watched her work. He watched the way she thought, always slightly ahead of where they were, always considering what came next, what could go wrong, and how to manage it if it did. It was a kind of intelligence that he recognized and respected because it was practical and hard-won and not interested in being noticed. That night, camped in a stand of cottonwood along the creek, she made a soup from the last of the dried rabbit and some roots she'd dug from the creek bank, roots she'd identified by some combination of memory and knowledge that he wouldn't have had in 100 years. It was thin but warm, and it helped. He ate it and looked at the fire and thought about the fact that he was alive primarily because of choices she'd made, where to camp, what route to take, what to eat, when to stop. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why are you going to Bozeman, specifically? You said the Silver Crest, but—" He tried to find the right way to phrase it. "A town that's growing that fast with that kind of money moving through it is not necessarily friendly to people like me." That's what I was trying to say without saying it. She looked at the fire for a moment. "Because the alternative is going somewhere friendlier and smaller and spending the rest of my life making food that doesn't challenge me for people who don't notice." A pause. "I'm good enough for a place like the Silver Crest. Better than whoever they have. I've known that for a while. The question is whether I'm willing to go somewhere that'll fight me on it, and the answer I've been arriving at, slowly, is that I'd rather fight and lose than succeed somewhere that doesn't require me to be everything I am." He was quiet. He thought about what she'd said. That's, he started. Don't tell me it's brave, she said. I hate that word when men use it for women doing ordinary things. I wasn't going to say brave, he said. I was going to say it sounds lonely. That caught her. He could see it. A brief stillness, the kind that comes when something lands closer to the truth than expected. Then she nodded, just slightly. It is, she said. So far, most of it has been. They came down out of the mountains on the afternoon of the third day, the terrain opening up ahead of them into the valley country. The white peaks behind them and the gray-brown flatland of the Gallatin Valley stretched out to the south and west. The air was colder here, colder than the highlands in a different way. The open cold of exposed plains rather than the enclosed cold of the mountains. But the sky was clear for the first time in days, and the light was flat and bright off the snow. Coulter could see, far in the distance, the smudge of smoke that meant settlement. That meant Bozeman. He stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Farther than it looks, Tessa said, coming up alongside him. She was reading the distance the same way she read everything, with clear eyes and no illusions. 2 more days at least, given the road conditions. I know. He paused. You ready for it? She looked at the distant smudge of smoke. Her expression was the one he'd come to recognize. Not calm exactly, but settled. The expression of someone who had thought about something for a long time and was done thinking and ready to do. I've been ready for it for years, she said. Ready doesn't mean I'm not scared. I know. She looked at him. Do you? He thought about the trail behind them. The avalanche slope he hadn't seen, the ice crossing, the valley he would have gotten lost in without her route notes. He thought about being a man who was very good at certain things and had been quietly, consistently shown over the last several days where those things ended. I know what it's like, he said, to feel like you should be further along than you are, and to have to keep going anyway. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she clicked to Frank and started walking. He fell in alongside her. The mountains were behind them now, white and enormous, and already beginning to look abstract with distance, the way hard things always did when you got far enough from them. But they didn't disappear. They stayed there on the horizon, cold and real, the way hard things always did. She walked ahead of him slightly, leading the mule, her coat dark against the pale landscape, her tracks sharp in the fresh snow. She didn't look back. She was already thinking about what came next. He could tell by the set of her shoulders, the forward lean of her posture, the same quality of attention he'd watched her direct at everything over the past 3 days. He watched her and thought, without any clear sense of what it meant yet, that he was glad he'd smelled the wood smoke, that he was glad he'd followed it down the mountain, that something in the past 3 days had shifted something in him. What exactly, he couldn't have named, but it was there, and it was real, and it was connected to the woman walking ahead of him toward a town that didn't know she was coming, Bozeman. The Silver Crest Hotel. A kitchen that didn't know yet what was about to walk through its doors. He adjusted the pack on his back and picked up his pace until he was walking beside her again. She didn't acknowledge it, but she didn't slow down either. They walked south through the cold white afternoon, 2 people with different wounds and the same stubborn forward motion, toward a town that would remember both of them long after the snow of that winter had melted and been forgotten. The road into Bozeman took 2 more days, and neither of them were easy. The valley country looked open from the high ground, but down in it the snow was wind-packed and uneven, the road barely visible under the drifts, and Frank the mule developed an opinion about a stretch of ice-glazed creek crossing on the first afternoon that required 20 minutes of negotiation before he'd go. Tessa handled it with a patience that Coulter wouldn't have had, talking to the animal low and even, not forcing, just waiting, nudging, waiting again, until Frank made his own peace with it and stepped forward. Does that work on men, too? Coulter asked when they were across. Less reliably, she said. Men argue back. He laughed. It surprised him. The laugh, and the fact that she'd made him do it. He hadn't laughed at anything in about 2 weeks, and it felt strange in his chest, like a muscle being used after a long rest. They camped that night in an abandoned line shack they found off the main road. A single-room structure with a dirt floor and a rusted stove that still drew air and took a fire. It was cold, and it smelled like old animal, and the roof had a hole in one corner that let in a thin draft. But it was 4 walls and a fire, and Coulter thought he'd rarely been more grateful for four walls and a fire in his life. Tessa made coffee, real coffee, from a small tin she'd been rationing carefully, and they sat on opposite sides of the stove and held the cups and were quiet for a while. "Tell me about your brother," she said. He looked at her. "You mentioned him, back in the camp, first night of the storm." She held her cup in both hands. "You said you carried guilt over a brother you failed to save. I've been thinking about it." "That's a personal thing to bring up." "I know." She looked at him without apology. "You don't have to." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind moved over the shack's walls with a low, hollow sound. "His name was Eli," he said. "Younger than me by 3 years. He had a quality to him that I never had. The kind of person that people liked immediately, that rooms felt better with." He stopped. "He followed me west. 19 years old, convinced I was living some kind of life worth following." He turned the cup in his hands. There was a river crossing, spring thaw, water running high and fast. I was across. I told him to wait, to let the water drop, but Eli never did anything slowly in his life. He went in. A pause. "He went in, and the current took him. I went in after him. I got him to a gravel bar. I thought I had him." His jaw tightened. "The fever came 3 days later, something he got from the water. I didn't know enough to do anything about it. Didn't know who to find or where to go. Watched him for a week, and then I buried him in ground I'd never seen before and haven't been back to since." The stove ticked. Tessa didn't say anything immediately, and he appreciated that she didn't rush to fill the silence with something that would have made it smaller. "How long ago?" she said. 7 years? "You still think about it the same way? Like it was your fault?" "I think about the moment I told him it was all right to come across." He set the cup down. "I shouldn't have. The water was still too high. I was impatient. I wanted to keep moving." He looked at the stove. "I've been trying to outrun impatient ever since." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think you outrun something like that," she said finally. "I think you just carry it differently over time. Lighter sometimes, some days heavier." "That's a grim comfort." "It's an honest one." She drank the last of her coffee. "I think you know the difference." He did. He'd known it from the first night in her camp, that she was someone who didn't offer comfortable lies because she'd had too many of them offered to her, and understood exactly how little they were worth. They banked the fire and slept on opposite sides of the small room, rolled in their coats, and in the morning they rose before the light and were on the road again before the sky had finished deciding what color it wanted to be. The second day brought them down out of the foothills and into the Gallatin Valley proper, and the town announced itself gradually. First a smell of coal smoke and livestock, then the sound of hammering from somewhere ahead, then the shape of buildings against the gray winter sky. And then Bozeman itself, raw and loud and sprawling in the way that towns sprawl when they're growing faster than anyone planned for. Main Street was mud under a skin of ice, churned up by wagon wheels and horse traffic, and the feet of several hundred people who all seemed to have somewhere urgent to be. Buildings in various states of completion lined both sides, some finished, some still just frames, one that appeared to be both simultaneously, with a storefront open for business at the bottom, and open sky where the second floor was supposed to be. Voices overlapped. A freight wagon sat jackknifed in the middle of the street while its driver argued with a man in a heavy coat. Somewhere behind the main street, a mill of some kind was running, and its rhythm gave the whole town a pulse, like a heartbeat that was going a little too fast. Tessa walked into it like she'd been expecting exactly this. Not comfortable, not overwhelmed, just taking it in with those clear eyes, reading it the way she read terrain. "Louder than I remembered," she said. "You've been here before?" "Passed through 2 years ago. It was half this size." She looked down the street. "The Silver Crest is on the north end, or it was. They found it. It had grown since she'd last seen it. A proper 2-story hotel now, with a painted sign and a front porch that had a few chairs on it, occupied despite the cold by 2 men smoking pipes. It looked like the most substantial building on that end of the street, which was probably intentional. A hotel that wanted the money of men who'd struck it, wanted to look like the kind of place that money belonged. Tessa stopped across the street from it and looked at it for a long moment. "All right," she said. "You want company?" Coulter asked. "No." She adjusted the strap of her pack. If I walk in there with a man, whatever happens, they'll be talking to you, not me. She glanced at him. I'll find you after. There's a livery on the south end that'll take Frank. I know what a livery is. I know you know. She looked at the hotel again. Wish me something. Something, he said. She almost smiled. Then she crossed the street and went up the porch steps and through the door, and he stood on the far side of the street and watched her go. He found the livery, arranged for Frank, found himself a room at a boarding house 2 blocks off Main Street run by a woman named Mrs. Hadley, who fed him a plate of salt pork and boiled potatoes without being asked, and charged him a reasonable rate. He cleaned up as well as he could manage with cold water and a small mirror, and then he went out to see about registering with the local law, because he was still technically on assignment, and that was still technically his job. The Bozeman Marshal's office was a 1-room building next to the hardware store. The marshal was a heavyset man named Ira Flood, who'd been in the territory for 20 years and had the kind of face that suggested those years had been educational. He listened to Coulter's explanation of the Falk situation with the expression of a man who had heard many variations of similar stories. Lost him in the Highlands, Coulter said. Storm came in. Tracks were buried. Falk! Flood pulled at his beard. Denny Falk, I've heard the name. Horse thief, right? Suspected murder, too. The Homesteader case out of Mager County. That one. Flood nodded slowly. He'll turn up somewhere. Men like that always do. They can't help themselves. He looked at Coulter with the mild, assessing interest of one professional evaluating another. You looking to stay in the area while you wait him out? I hadn't thought that far. We could use another deputy, temporarily, at minimum. Town's growing faster than the law is, which is not an arrangement that stays comfortable for long. He nodded toward the window and the noise of the street beyond. Half the men coming through here are fine. A quarter of them are carrying something from wherever they left. The other quarter, he shrugged. You know, Coulter knew. Let me think on it, he said. Fair enough. Come back when you've thought. He was back on the street turning toward the boarding house when he heard his name. He looked up and saw Tessa coming toward him from the direction of the Silver Crest, and he couldn't immediately read her expression, which was unusual because he'd become reasonably good at reading her expressions over the past 5 days. How did it go? He asked. She stopped in front of him, looked at the street, looked at him. They offered me a position, she said. That's washing dishes and assisting with prep work. Her voice was flat. The head cook is a man named Beaumont, who's been running that kitchen for 18 months. They introduced me to him. He shook my hand like he was doing me a favor and said he was always glad to have a hard worker. A pause. Hard worker? Coulter said nothing. I'm a hard worker, Tessa said. I am also considerably better at my job than he is. I could tell that from looking at the menu they had written on the board inside. There are 4 dishes on it. 2 of them are wrong. The braised short rib, the way they're making it, is going to be tough every time because the temperature is too high and the time is too short. The bread pudding doesn't have enough egg to set properly. She exhaled. I know this without tasting either one. What did you tell them? I told them I'd think about the dishwashing position. She said it with a dark, dry humor that didn't quite cover the edge underneath. I didn't tell them what I was thinking. He walked alongside her back toward the boarding house. The street noise moved around them. Freight wagons, voices, the mill running its endless rhythm. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to take the position, she said. Temporarily. I'm going to go into that kitchen and do whatever they put in front of me, and I'm going to do it better than they've ever seen it done, and I'm going to watch and wait and find my moment. She said it plainly, without drama. It's what I've always done. It's what I know how to do. That sounds like it takes a long time. Everything worth having does. She glanced sideways at him. How did it go with the marshal? He offered me a temporary position. She stopped walking, looked at him. You're going to stay. It wasn't quite a question. He realized, standing there in the cold mud of a boomtown street, that the answer was already made, had maybe been made somewhere back in those mountains, and that he just hadn't said it out loud yet. For a while, he said. Falk is still out there somewhere, and Flood's right that the town needs it. Those aren't the only reasons, she said. No, he said, they're not. She looked at him for a moment with that particular quality of attention she had. The honest, straight-on kind that didn't dress itself up. Then she nodded once, and they kept walking. The boarding house was warm and smelled like supper starting, and Mrs. Hadley had a second room available at a rate that was almost reasonable for a town of this size. Tessa took it. They ate dinner at a long common table with 4 other boarders: a surveyor, a hardware merchant, a widow who'd come west to join a son, and a young man from Ohio who was going to make his fortune and said so twice. And the conversation was the usual kind, surface and exploratory. The conversation of strangers sharing a table and testing the water. Tessa was quiet through most of it. Not shy. She answered when spoken to, directly and without fuss. But conserving something. Saving it for the kitchen, Coulter thought, for what came next. After supper, he sat on the porch of the boarding house in the cold, watching the street, and she came out after a while and stood at the railing. "I've been thinking about Eli," she said. He looked at her. "What you said, about being impatient, about telling him it was all right to cross." She leaned against the post. "I don't think that's what actually haunts you. I think what haunts you is that you can't know. Whether waiting would have mattered. Whether if you'd made the other choice, you'd be standing here blaming yourself for that instead." She looked at the street. "Grief doesn't always make logical sense. It finds whatever surface it can stick to." He was quiet for a long time. "When did you get so good at reading people?" "Lifetime of people deciding they knew things about me that they didn't." She looked at him briefly. "You start to see how the whole machinery works, what people actually mean versus what they say, what they're afraid of versus what they claim." A beat. "You, for instance." "What about me?" "You're afraid that if you stop moving, stop having something to chase, you'll have to figure out who you actually are when there's nothing in front of you." She said it without cruelty, just clear. The Falk case was convenient that way. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not saying it as a criticism," she said. "I understand it. I've done versions of it myself. The kitchen is always easy to hide in when you don't want to think about the rest." The street noise had thinned as the evening wore on. A few lanterns still lit windows. Somewhere down the block, a piano in a saloon was working through something that might have been a waltz. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "I know. That's an annoying quality. I've been told." The small, real smile again, quick and gone. "Good night, deputy." She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, looking at the town that he'd apparently decided to stay in, thinking about what she'd said, and finding it settling somewhere in him the way true things did. Not comfortably, but usefully. Like something finally named that had been circling without a name for too long. In the weeks that followed, Bozeman proved to be exactly what it looked like from the outside. A place in the middle of becoming something, with all the noise and disorder and occasional violence that entailed. Coulter took the deputy position and found himself earning it immediately. There were disputes over lots and claims that turned physical. There were men passing through who'd left problems behind them in other territories. There were the ordinary emergencies of a winter town growing faster than its infrastructure. Fires, accidents, the particular kind of desperation that came from men who'd staked everything on a place and were beginning to suspect it wouldn't pay off the way they'd imagined. He was good at most of it. He was patient in a way that surprised people who looked at his size and assumed he wasn't, and he could read a room quickly enough to know when a situation was going to turn before it did, which was worth more than being fast with a gun, though he was adequate at that too. Tessa started at the Silvercrest on a Thursday morning. She told him about it at dinner that first evening, brief and factual. Beaumont had given her prep work, root vegetables, bread, basic stock, and she'd done it to a standard that was, by her account, noticeably better than what they'd been producing, and Beaumont had said nothing about it either way. "Did he notice?" Coulter asked. "Of course he noticed." She cut her bread. "He's not stupid. He just doesn't know what to do with it yet." "How long do you think before he does?" "Depends on the man." She thought about it. 2 weeks, maybe. He either starts using what I can do, or he starts resenting it. Those are usually the only 2 options. It was closer to 10 days. She came to dinner one evening with a quality to her silence that he'd learned to read. The tightened inward quality that meant something had happened and she was still processing whether to be angry about it. "What?" he said. "Beaumont put me on the main line tonight." She set down her fork. without asking me, just pointed at the station and told me to run the meat course. That's not a bad thing? No, it's not. She picked up the fork again. What's a bad thing is that when the dining room started sending back compliments, and they did, 3 tables sent back compliments, which apparently doesn't happen often, Beaumont accepted them, directly, to the owner. A pause. I was standing 6 feet away. Coulter looked at her. What did you do? Nothing. I kept cooking. She ate. What else would I do? You could have said something. Said something. She looked at him with the patient, flat expression she used when she thought he was being slow. To the owner, in front of Beaumont. First week of a new job. She shook her head. That's not how it works. You know that. I know. I'll get my moment, she said. Just, not yet. He believed her. Watching her over those weeks, the way she moved through obstacles with a kind of tactical patience that was genuinely impressive, he understood that she wasn't being passive. She was being strategic. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why, and the restraint was harder and required more strength than the outburst would have. It made him feel, at moments, like he should be taking notes. The winter deepened through December and into January. The Gallatin Valley under heavy snow was a particular kind of beautiful and a particular kind of brutal, and the two of them moved through it, their separate days converging in the evenings at Mrs. Hadley's table, or sometimes at one of the 2 restaurants that were fit for regular people, rather than men looking to spend money they hadn't earned yet. They talked about everything and nothing, about the town, its characters, its emerging power structures, who owned what, who was going to matter, and who only thought they were. About cooking. She talked about cooking the way some people talked about music, with a precision and a passion that were oddly moving, technical, and emotional at the same time. About the law, the particular ethics of it, where it held and where it bent and where it broke entirely, and what you did in those cases. He told her about growing up in Nebraska, his father's failed farm, his mother who died young from something that had no name back then, but probably had a name now, the particular flatness of the landscape and the way it had made him want horizon in a direction that wasn't just more flat. She told him about the years after the hotel cook died, the series of kitchens, the accumulation of skills, the slow building of a sense of her own worth that other people kept trying to dismantle. It was almost systematic, she said once, like there was a rule somewhere that said, she's getting too settled, knock her down a little. A new kitchen, a new boss, a new set of assumptions about what I was and what I was good for. She looked at the window, at the snow coming down outside. I got very good at starting over. I don't know if that's a skill or a wound. Maybe both, he said. Maybe both, she agreed. What he noticed, what he couldn't have explained to anyone at the time but understood clearly in retrospect, was that she was the first person he'd spent significant time with in years who treated him as though she actually saw him. Not the badge, not the size, not the reputation he'd built doing a job he was good at. Just him, with all the uncertainty and guilt, and the forward motion that was still partly running from something it hadn't named. She saw that and she didn't make it smaller or larger than it was. She just acknowledged it, which was, he was discovering, a rarer thing than it had any right to be. January brought a cold snap that froze the streets solid and kept most people inside for the better part of a week. And it was during that week that something shifted at the Silver Crest in a way that would matter. Beaumont fell sick, fever and chills, something that had been going around, and was out for 3 days. The owner, a man named Gerald Hatch, came back to the kitchen looking for someone to run service and found Tessa already running it, not taking over, not performing, just doing what needed to be done, because it needed to be done, and doing it with the calm authority of someone who had been doing this for years and wasn't particularly interested in making a show of it. She ran 3 dinner services that week. The dining room, according to what Coulter heard from 2 different people who'd eaten there, had been the best it had been since the hotel opened. Beaumont came back and said nothing about it. Hatch said nothing either, not to Tessa, but Coulter saw the way the man looked at her when he came through the kitchen, the recalculating look, the one people got when they were updating an assessment they'd made too quickly. He recognized it because he'd worn it himself, back on the slope above a snowy hollow, the day he'd discovered that the woman feeding him was a step ahead of him in more ways than he'd anticipated. Tessa came to dinner that Friday with an energy about her that was different from the controlled patience of the previous weeks. Not triumphant. She was never triumphant about things, which he was coming to understand was both a strength and something that cost her, but alive in a particular way, like something had been confirmed. "He's going to offer me a promotion," she said. "Hatch? He's going to offer me something, not enough, but something." She ate. "And I'm going to take it, and I'm going to keep going." What would enough look like? She looked at him. "Running the kitchen," she said. "My menu, my staff, my decisions. Not assisting, not advising." A pause. "Head chef. That's what I came here for." "You'll get there." "I know I will." She said it without arrogance, just certainty, the kind that comes from actually knowing what you're capable of and having been tested enough times to trust it. The question is how long it takes and how much it costs. He looked at her across the table, at the steadiness of her, the held-ground quality that had struck him from the first night in the camp, and the things underneath it that he could see now because she'd let him see them. The loneliness, the weariness, the banked fire of something that had been refused too many times and hadn't quit. He thought about what she'd said about him, on the boarding house porch, the fear of stopping, the fugitive as excuse. He thought about what it would mean to stop. He looked at Tessa Crow and thought that stopping, if it meant staying in the same place as her, was maybe not the thing he'd always imagined it to be. Not stagnation, not surrender, but arrival. Getting somewhere. Being somewhere. He didn't say any of that. It was too early for any of that, and they were both too careful to rush a thing that was still finding its shape. But he thought it. And somewhere across the table, he suspected from the quality of her attention that she was thinking something adjacent to it, and that neither of them was quite ready to say it, and that was all right. Some things moved slowly. Some things needed time and testing before they could bear weight. The snow kept coming down outside, and the town kept growing around them. And somewhere out in the territory, Denny Falk was either alive or dead, and didn't know yet that he'd become much less important than he used to be. Hatch made his offer on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February, calling Tessa into the small office off the hotel lobby while the breakfast service was still being cleared. Coulter heard about it that evening, sitting across from her at Mrs. Hadley's table with the other boarders gone and the kitchen noise winding down. "Assistant head cook," she said. 30% more than I'm making now. My name on the menu board." "Your name on the board." "Tessa Crow, assistant." She said it with a dry precision that made the word sound exactly like what it was. A qualifier, a reduction, a way of acknowledging her ability while making sure it stayed one step below the line that mattered. "Beaumont keeps his title. I do more of the work. Everyone pretends this is a promotion." "Is it?" "It's leverage," she said, "if I take it correctly." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I told him I'd consider it. I asked for 2 days." "What are you going to ask for in return?" She looked at him. "How do you know I'm going to ask for something?" "Because you don't do anything without understanding what you're trading," he said. "You've been in that kitchen 6 weeks. You know exactly what it's worth and exactly what you're worth. You're going to ask for something specific." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding whether to find that observation intrusive or accurate. She landed on accurate. "Menu input," she said. "Not control, not yet, but I want the right to propose dishes. In writing. To be considered, not just listened to and ignored." A pause. "And I want it in whatever agreement we make, written down." "That's a smart ask." "It's a necessary one." She set the cup down. "A man in my position would have it automatically. It would never occur to anyone to deny it. I have to ask for it explicitly, because if I don't, it won't exist." He didn't argue with that because it was true, and they both knew it, and there was nothing useful to add. She went back to Hatch the following day and made her counter. He pushed back on the written menu input, said it wasn't how they did things, said Beaumont ran the kitchen and always had. She waited him out. He came back around to a version of it that was less formal than she'd wanted, but more than nothing. She took it. She signed. She came out of the hotel and found Coulter on the far side of the street, where he'd positioned himself with no particular excuse, and she crossed to him and said, "It's done. How do you feel?" "Like I got about 60% of what I wanted." She started walking, and he fell in beside her. "Which is 60% more than I had yesterday. So, he agreed. What happened over the next 2 months was the kind of thing that looks, from the outside, like steady progress, and was, in fact, steady progress. But the internal experience of it was grinding and slow and punctuated by setbacks that didn't show up in the final account. Beaumont was not a bad man. He was a mediocre cook who had survived by being reliable and agreeable, and by working in places where reliability and agreeableness were valued more than excellence. The problem with Tessa was that her presence made his mediocrity visible in a way it hadn't been before. And he responded to that the way most people responded to having their limitations made visible, not with grace. He started taking credit for her dishes. Not openly, not in a way that anyone could point to directly, but in the accumulated small ways that added up, accepting compliments without correction, describing a technique she'd developed as something he'd been working on, making changes to her proposed dishes before they went out. Small changes, unnecessary ones, so that if a dish failed, there was always a layer of his involvement to point to, and if it succeeded, the origin story was blurry enough to absorb. She cataloged it without reacting to it. She told Coulter about it in the evenings with the flat, precise tone she used when she was being factual rather than emotional. And he listened and didn't offer advice unless she asked, which was rare because she didn't need advice. She needed someone to actually hear what she was describing. "Doesn't it make you furious?" he asked once. "Of course it makes me furious." She looked at him. "What good would furious do right now?" "It might make you feel better." "It might, for about an hour. And then I'd still be in the same kitchen with the same situation, and I'd have burned something in the process that I might need later." She looked at the window. "Fury is expensive. I spend it carefully." He thought about that for a long time after. March came in hard, one last assault of winter before the season broke, and with it came two things that changed the shape of everything. The first was a letter from the Helena office telling Coulter that Denny Falk had been apprehended in Missoula County by a different marshal, alive and already in custody, which closed the case and technically ended Coulter's assignment in Bozeman. The second was a dinner party at the Silver Crest that Gerald Hatch had been planning for weeks, a gathering of Bozeman's emerging merchant class and several investors from the East who were looking at the territory's growth and smelling opportunity. Hatch came to Tessa directly, bypassed Beaumont entirely. "I need the best dinner this hotel has ever served," he said. "Money's not a concern. What do you need?" She told Coulter about it that night, and there was something different in her voice. Not excitement exactly, but a heightened attention, the quality of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it when it arrived. "Beaumont's going to be a problem," she said. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where Hatch came to me directly, and Beaumont knows it." She looked at her hands on the table. "He's not going to make it easy." "Can Hatch protect you?" "Hatch is going to protect his dinner party," she said. "Whether that means protecting me depends on whether he understands that those are the same thing, and I don't know yet if he's smart enough to see that." She paused. "I'm going to cook that dinner like my life depends on it." "Your career depends on it." "Same thing," she said. "For me, right now, same thing." She spent 4 days planning the menu, not at the hotel, but at the boarding house table after dinner, with a notebook and a worn copy of a culinary reference she carried in her pack, cross-referencing ingredient availability in Bozeman in March with what she wanted to achieve. Coulter watched her work some evenings and was struck, not for the first time, by the quality of her concentration, the way the world around her ceased to register when she was fully in it. "Tell me what you're making," he said one evening. She looked up like she'd forgotten he was there. Then she tilted her head slightly and started. She described a 6-course dinner with the same kind of detail that a military man might describe a campaign, the logic of the sequence, why each course prepared you for the next, the specific techniques she was going to use and why, what impression she wanted each dish to leave before it gave way to the one that followed. He didn't understand half of it technically. He understood all of it in the way that mattered. "That sounds like something worth eating," he said. "It should be the best meal those people have had west of Chicago," she said. Not bragging, just assessing. "And if it is, Hatch will have to acknowledge where it came from." "And if Beaumont tries to take credit?" She looked at him. "I'm going to make sure the guests know my name before the first course goes out. Hatch can introduce me, or I'll introduce myself, but they'll know." The night of the dinner party came on a Friday in the 3rd week of March. Coulter wasn't there. He had no reason to be at a Silvercrest dinner party. But He had the strange experience of walking past the hotel twice during the course of the evening and seeing the warm light in the dining room windows, and knowing she was somewhere behind that building in the kitchen doing what she did, and feeling a kind of tension on her behalf that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with. He went back to the boarding house and waited. She came in after 11, when everyone else had gone to bed. She sat down at the kitchen table and he poured her a cup of tea from the pot he'd kept on the back of the stove, and she wrapped both hands around it and was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said. "The duck was perfect," she said. "The chestnut soup was better than I expected. The dessert course—" She stopped. They were quiet for a moment after the first bite of the dessert. The whole table. That kind of quiet. That's a good sign. That's the best sign there is, so she drank the tea. Hatch stood up before the dessert was cleared and introduced me to the table. By name, by title, he said, "Head chef." She paused. He said, "Head chef." Coulter was quiet. Beaumont was standing 6 feet away, she said. Hatch didn't look at him. She looked at the table. "I don't know what that means for tomorrow. I don't know how Beaumont's going to respond or what Hatch actually intends. But tonight—" She stopped. "Tonight I cooked the best meal of my life in front of the people in this town who have the most power to decide what happens next, and they knew my name when they left." "That's everything you planned for." "It's the first part of everything I planned for." She looked at him, and in the low light of the kitchen, there was something on her face that he hadn't seen before. Not happiness, exactly, but relief. The particular kind of relief that comes when you've been right about something for a very long time, and the world has finally, briefly, agreed with you. "I feel like I can breathe," she said. "I don't think I realized how long I'd been holding it." He looked at her. He thought about saying something. He decided that the moment didn't need anything added to it. She knew what she'd done, and she knew that he knew, and that was enough. She finished the tea and went to bed, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, thinking about head chef and the quiet at the dessert table, and about a woman who'd been right about herself for years while the world took its time catching up. What followed was not a clean ascension. Life in a growing frontier town did not arrange itself into clean ascensions. Beaumont, to his credit and Coulter's surprise, left the Silvercrest of his own accord 2 weeks after the dinner party, took a position at a hotel in Billings without drama or visible rancor, which Tessa said was either good grace or the recognition that the situation was no longer tenable and he was choosing to leave before he was displaced. Either way, she was now running the kitchen, and running it transformed her in ways that were visible even to people who didn't know her well. She was not softer. She never became softer. That wasn't the direction she changed. But she became more fully herself, more entirely present in each space she occupied. She hired 3 people over the following month, including a young woman named Pearl, who was 17 and had been working as a laundress, and had, according to Tessa's assessment after a single conversation and one informal test in the kitchen, a natural palate and an instinct for flavor that was rarer than most people who called themselves cooks would ever develop. "She's untrained," Coulter noted when Tessa told him. "Everyone was untrained once," she said. "The question is whether someone's willing to teach them." Pearl turned out to be the right call. The other 2 hires, a man named Roderick who'd cooked on a riverboat and had technique without imagination, and a girl named Clara who was steady and hardworking even if her instincts were ordinary, were solid choices. The kitchen became a functioning unit. The dining room's reputation grew. And then, in May, just as the mud of the Bozeman streets was beginning to dry, and the mountains had traded their winter white for the first green of the season, the first serious trouble came. It started small, the way serious trouble often does, in the gap between what people expected and what they found. A table of 4 men, cattle money from the eastern part of the territory, the kind that had come with preconceptions and intended to keep them, sent back a complaint. Not about the food, about who'd made it. One of the men had been told, somewhere between sitting down and opening the menu, that the Silvercrest kitchen was run by a woman, and he'd expressed his opinion of this arrangement to the waiter in terms that were audible at adjacent tables. The waiter brought the complaint to Tessa. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send out the next course." The waiter hesitated. "Ma'am, he's saying he won't eat food that—" "I heard what you said," Tessa told him. "Send out the next course." The next course went out, then the one after. All four men ate every dish. Not one plate came back unfinished. But the man, his name was Garrett Pell, and he was the kind of man who needed the last word in every situation, stopped in front of the kitchen door on his way out and said something through it that Coulter would later describe, when he heard about it, as the kind of thing that was designed to wound rather than to communicate. Something about women who forgot their place. Something about a frontier town that let itself be embarrassed this way. Pearl was nearest the door. She was 17 and she'd been on her feet for 11 hours, and she had, it turned out, less patience for this specific category of man than she had for most things. She started to respond. Tessa crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and put a hand on Pearl's arm. Not hard, just present. Go check the dessert, she said quietly. Pearl went. Tessa opened the kitchen door. She was a woman of medium height who worked with her hands for a living and stood in kitchens where heat and pressure were the baseline conditions. And something about the way she filled the door frame in that moment made Pell take a half step back without appearing to notice he'd done it. If you have a complaint about the food, she said, I'm the person to bring it to. In here, face to face. Pell looked at her. He was a big man, heavy through the chest, with the confidence of someone who had not often been contradicted. I wasn't complaining about the food, he said. The food was fine. Then I don't know what you're doing at my kitchen door. The word my landed in the air between them. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved from the doorframe. Pell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that was intended as dismissive, adjusted his coat, and walked away. Tessa stood in the doorway until he was gone. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished the closing service without saying another word about it. Coulter heard the story from 2 sources. Pearl, who told it with the admiring fury of someone still burning from the original insult, and Hatch, who called Coulter in to ask whether Pell was the kind of man likely to cause further trouble, which told Coulter something about what Hatch had seen and something about the fact that Hatch had felt the need to consult law enforcement rather than simply backing his own chef. Is she all right? Coulter asked Hatch. She seems fine, Hatch said, in the tone of a man who found competent women slightly baffling. That's... He paused. Yes, she handled it. When Coulter saw Tessa that evening, she was tired in the bone-deep way that had less to do with physical labor than with the specific exhaustion of being who she was in the world she was in. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she sat at the table with her back against the wall and her feet flat on the floor like she was anchoring herself. I heard about Pell, he said. Word travels fast. It's a small town. He paused. You handled it right. I handled it the way I could handle it, she said. There's a difference. She looked at the table. If I'd said everything I wanted to say, Hatch loses a cattle account and suddenly my kitchen's a problem instead of an asset. If Pearl had said it, she stopped. I won't let Pearl pay for something that's aimed at me. She admires you. I know. That's the part that scares me. She looked up. When people look at you that way, you're responsible for what they learn from watching, and I'm not... A small exhale. I'm not always sure I'm doing this right enough to be the thing someone learns from. You're doing it honestly, he said. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. No, he agreed, but it's the part you can control. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her deciding something. Pell came back, she said, tonight, after I thought it was finished. He came around to the back of the hotel, the alley entrance that the kitchen staff use. She said it evenly. He wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him. Coulter went still. What happened? Roderick was taking out the waste bins. They said some things to him, the kind of things men say to other men when they want them to understand that they're willing to be physical about it. She looked at her hands. Roderick came in and told me. I went out. Coulter looked at her. You went out. I told them that the alley belonged to the hotel, and if they came back again, I would be speaking to the marshal's office first thing in the morning, and that in a town where cattle money wanted to build a reputation, being the men who harassed kitchen workers in an alley was not the reputation worth building. She paused. Then I stood there until they left. He exhaled slowly. You should have sent for me. By the time I'd sent for you and you'd arrived, whatever was going to happen would have already happened. She looked at him steadily. I handled it. You shouldn't have been out there alone. My staff shouldn't have been out there at all. Something shifted in her voice. Not anger, but the thing underneath anger. the bedrock of it. I'm not going to run a kitchen where my people stand alone in alleys because I'm afraid to stand in one. A pause. That's not the place I'm trying to build. He looked at her for a long time. He thought about the doorframe, about my kitchen, about 17-year-old Pearl who had learned in the course of one evening exactly what her boss was made of. All right, he said. All right. I'm going to pay a visit to Pell in the morning, he said. Official capacity, just to establish that the marshal's office takes a particular interest in the area around the Silvercrest Hotel. He held up a hand before she could speak. Not on your behalf. On behalf of the town. Which is my job. She studied him. That's a careful distinction. I'm a careful man. Something shifted in her expression. Not the small, quick smile, but something quieter and more sustained, something that stayed. Yes, she said. You are. He visited Pell the following morning in the man's room at one of the other hotels, in the polite, specific way that a marshal's deputy visited men who needed to understand the shape of the law in a given town without anyone having to say anything unpleasant. Pell was a man who understood power and responded to clear demonstrations of it. The conversation was brief. Pell and his associates left Bozeman that afternoon. When Tessa heard, she didn't thank him directly. She came to dinner that evening and put a bowl of something on the table in front of him. A venison stew with herbs he couldn't name, rich and dark and precise, and sat down across from him and picked up her fork. You didn't have to do that, she said, meaning the stew. I know. He tried it. It was extraordinary. He didn't say that because it would have sounded like he was commenting on the stew, and they both understood that the stew was not the point. Thank you. You're the one who went to see him. You're the one who stood in the alley, he said. I just made sure he understood it wasn't a fluke. She looked at him across the table, and in the specific quality of the silence between them, there was something that had been building for months. Not slowly exactly, but carefully. The way structures are built when the people doing the building know that what they're making is supposed to last. It was there in the way she'd described the dinner party to him over late-night tea, in the way he'd kept the stove warm and waited, in the way she'd said you are, when he said he was a careful man, like she'd been paying attention and it had registered in a place that mattered. Neither of them said anything about it. They were both, in their particular ways, people who needed a thing to be real before they were willing to name it, and it was not quite real yet. But it was getting there. They could both feel it getting there, and feeling it was enough for now. The spring deepened. The town grew louder. The Silvercrest dining room started turning people away on Friday evenings, and Hatch, who was a man who ultimately let money make his decisions for him, began talking about expanding the kitchen, which was a conversation that Tessa entered with a list of specific requirements she'd apparently been compiling for some time. And in the marshal's office, Coulter renewed his temporary appointment for a second term, and when Flood asked him, gruff and direct, whether he was planning to make it permanent, he said he was thinking about it seriously, and Flood said that was good enough for now, and they shook hands, and that was that. Out in the wider territory, the name Denny Falk became a closed file, a man in a cell somewhere north of them, and with it closed something that Coulter realized he'd been using as a reason to hold himself slightly outside of wherever he was, as if keeping one foot in the manhunt meant he wasn't fully committed to anything. With the file closed, he had no more manhunt. He had a town and a job, and a woman who made venison stew and stood in alleys and occasionally, in quiet moments, looked at him with an expression that he was beginning to understand the full weight of. He was, he realized, somewhere he'd actually chosen to be. Not chasing, not fleeing, not passing through. He was, for what might have been the first time in a long time, simply there. The summer that followed was the best and worst season Tessa Crowe had lived through in recent memory, and the two qualities were so tangled together that she couldn't have separated them even if she'd wanted to. The best part was the kitchen. By June, the Silvercrest dining room had a reputation that reached past Bozeman into the surrounding county, and people were making the trip specifically to eat there, which was the kind of thing that had never happened before Tessa ran the place, and which Hatch mentioned frequently in a way that was meant to sound like gratitude, but contained within it the particular possessiveness of a man who believed that good things happening near him were fundamentally connected to him. She had expanded the menu, trained Pearl into a genuine sous chef position. The girl had a speed of learning that was sometimes startling, like watching someone run a road they'd been born knowing, and had begun sourcing ingredients from 2 local farms rather than relying entirely on the supply merchants, which gave her produce that was fresher and relationships that would matter later. The worst part was that she was running on about 4 hours of sleep most nights and didn't know how to stop. Coulter noticed it before she admitted it. He noticed it the way he'd learned to notice things about her, not intrusively, not by asking directly, but by paying attention to the small signals she gave off without meaning to. The way she held her coffee cup in the morning with both hands, even in warm weather, pressing it like she needed the weight of it. The way she sometimes went quiet in the middle of a sentence and came back to it a beat too late. The shadows under her eyes that June light couldn't quite wash out. "You're not sleeping," he said, one morning in early July, over breakfast at Mrs. Hadley's. "I'm sleeping enough." "How much is enough?" She looked at him. "Enough to function." "That's not what I asked." She set down her fork. She looked at the table, then at him, with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to be honest or economical with the truth. With him, she'd become more often honest than not, which he thought meant something, even if neither of them had said what. 4 hours, sometimes less. A pause. "There's a lot to do." "There's always going to be a lot to do," he said. "That's not going to change." "I know that." "Then 4 hours isn't a solution. It's a loan you're taking out against yourself." She was quiet. He could see that she knew he was right, and didn't particularly want him to be. "I'll manage it," she said. "People who say they'll manage it usually don't manage it," he said. "They manage until they can't." She didn't answer. She picked up her fork. The conversation was over, which didn't mean it was resolved. What broke it open wasn't a single event, but an accumulation. The dinner service on a Friday in mid-July was the biggest the Silvercrest had run. 32 covers, a full house, 3 large parties, including a ranching family celebrating a wedding anniversary who had sent word ahead that they expected something exceptional. Tessa ran the service from the front line, coordinating Pearl and Roderick and Clara, and a new hire named Sam who was still learning and required active management. Halfway through the service, the delivery of the main course to table 7 went wrong. Clara lost her timing, 2 plates went out late, and one of the guests, a woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to things going the way she expected, made a remark to the waiter that traveled back to the kitchen in the waiter's face before he'd said a word. Tessa corrected it. She always corrected it. She sent out an apology course, a small additional dish that wasn't on the menu, something she put together in 6 minutes from what was available on the line. The table accepted it. The service finished. The guests left. Then she stood at the sink afterward while Pearl and Sam cleaned the line, and she pressed both hands flat on the cold metal edge, and she felt the room tip slightly. "Miss Crow," Pearl's voice, sharp and close. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You're gray." "I need some air." She straightened. "I'll be outside." She made it to the alley door and leaned against the outside wall of the building in the warm July night and breathed. Her head was pounding. Her hands were shaking slightly. She could see it. She held them out and watched them shake, which was not something she was accustomed to watching. She'd been running on bad sleep and kitchen heat and the specific adrenaline that came with managing a high-pressure service for so many hours in a row that her body had apparently decided it was done, accepting that as a reasonable plan. Pearl appeared beside her. The girl said nothing, just stood there, which was the right call. After a few minutes, Tessa said, "Get Roderick to do the closing inventory. Clara knows where the log is." "Already told him," Pearl said. "I figured." Tessa looked at her. Pearl was 17 and she had flour on her arm, and she was watching her boss with an expression that was trying not to show fear and mostly failing. Tessa felt something shift in her chest. Not guilt exactly, but a related feeling. Responsibility. "I overdid it," Tessa said. It cost her something to say it out loud. "Yes, ma'am," Pearl said. Not unkind, just honest. "Don't tell anyone." Pearl's expression suggested she found this instruction difficult to process given the circumstances. Coulter found out anyway, because the next morning Tessa didn't come to breakfast, and Coulter went to her door and knocked. And after a long pause, she told him to come in, and he came in and found her sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, with her boots unlaced and her hands in her lap, which was not a configuration he'd ever seen her in. "You look terrible," he said. "I know." He pulled the chair from the desk and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything right away. He'd learned that with her, opening with the thing you wanted to say was often less effective than letting a silence develop, because she filled silences honestly when she trusted the person she was with. After a moment, she said, "Pearl thinks I should take a week off." "Pearl is 17 and she's right." Tessa looked at him. "I can't take a week off. The kitchen—" "Pearl is your sous chef," he said. "Roderick's been there 8 months. They can run a service without you." "I know they can run a service." She looked at her hands. "I know that logically. The problem is that when I'm not there—" She stopped. "Things go wrong. Little things. Things that don't matter on an ordinary night and do matter on a night when the table in the corner is someone Hatch is trying to impress." "Things are going to go wrong whether you're there or not," Coulter said. "You can't prevent every wrong thing by working yourself into the floor." "I know that too. So what's the real reason?" She was quiet. He waited. "If the kitchen is fine without me," she said finally, "then maybe I'm not as necessary as I think I am." He looked at her for a moment. "That's the least logical thing I've ever heard you say." "I know." A small exhale. "I never said it was logical." "Tessa." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "A kitchen that runs well when you're gone is a kitchen you built right. That's not evidence that you're unnecessary. It's evidence that you're good at your job." She looked at him. He could see that she was tired enough that the usual defenses weren't fully operating, that things were landing closer to the surface than they normally would. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It's not simple, but it's true." She looked at her unlaced boots. "I'll take 4 days," she said. "Not a week. 4 days. 5. 4.5. That's not a real number." She almost smiled, just barely. "Fine. 5 days. But Pearl sends me a note every evening." "That's fair," he said. "I'll make sure she does." She rested for 5 days. The kitchen didn't collapse. Pearl sent notes every evening, brief and factual, and Coulter noticed when Tessa showed him one, written with a confidence that Pearl was probably borrowing from watching Tessa herself. The Friday service ran slightly long, and one dish came out wrong, and Roderick handled it in a way that was less graceful than Tessa would have, but got the job done. By the time Tessa went back, on a Wednesday morning in late July, something in her had reset. Not fixed, not permanently resolved, but reset. The way a stretched thing returns to shape when you finally let go of the tension. It was during those 5 days, with more time on his hands than usual, that Coulter found the building. It was on a side street 2 blocks off Main, a solidly built single-story structure that had been a dry goods store until the owner had relocated to a larger space on the main road. The building sat empty now, its windows papered over, a for let sign nailed to the door in the particular way of signs that had been there long enough to stop expecting to be read. It was not beautiful. The front step had a crack in it. One of the window frames had warped slightly with last winter's moisture. The interior, when Coulter peered through a gap in the paper, was bare board floor and empty shelves, and the kind of dust that accumulates when a space hasn't been breathed in for months. He stood outside it for a long time. He walked the perimeter. He thought about the kitchen Tessa had described to him once, in abstract, in the way people describe things they want very much but have decided not to want out loud. The kind of kitchen where she made every decision, where the menu was entirely hers, where she was accountable to the food and to the people who came to eat it, and not to a hotel owner calculating return on investment. He went and found the owner and had a conversation about rent and terms, and then he sat on the information for 3 days while Tessa rested, and then she went back to the Silvercrest, and 2 weeks passed while he watched her rebuild her momentum and watched the hotel dining room fill up again on Friday nights, and watched Hatch look at his receipts with the satisfaction of a man benefiting from someone else's work. He told her on a Sunday evening in August, walking back from one of the restaurants they went to occasionally when Mrs. Hadley's was too crowded. The air was warm for the first time without qualification. A true summer evening, the sky still light at 8 o'clock, the smell of dust and horse, and the first green things coming up in the space between buildings. "I found a building," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of building?" "The kind with walls and a roof and a kitchen-sized space in the back." He told her about it. The location, the condition, the rent, the owner's terms. She was quiet through all of it. He'd learned to read her silences by category. This one was the thinking kind, not the closed kind. She was calculating, mapping it against things he couldn't see. You've been holding on to this for 3 weeks, she said. I wanted to make sure you were back on your feet before I brought it up. Because if I wasn't, I might have said no. Might have, he agreed. She looked at the street ahead of them. I don't have that kind of money, she said. I have savings, but not enough to start a restaurant. Rent, equipment, staff, supplies. The first 3 months before a place builds an audience, you're running on reserves. I'd run out. I have savings, he said. 7 years of a deputy's wages with not much to spend them on. He paused. And I have experience that's useful in a business context. Managing difficult situations. Knowing who in a town to talk to about what. He kept his voice level. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership. In something I think has a genuine chance. She stopped walking. He stopped too. They were standing on the side of the road with the summer evening around them, and somewhere behind them the piano in a saloon was working through something that wasn't quite music but was trying. You'd be giving up the deputy position, she said. I'd be changing what I do. He looked at her. I'm good at law work. I'm not sure it's what I want to be good at for the rest of my life. What do you want to be good at? He looked at her steadily. Something that lasts, he said. Something that's still standing in 20 years and means something to the people around it. A pause. And I'd be doing it with someone I trust completely, which is not a condition I've met before in any work context. She looked at him. The light was going amber and long across the street, and she had the expression she wore when something had landed close enough that she needed a moment before she could respond to it. If we do this, she said, it has to be equal. My name on the building, same as yours. My decisions in the kitchen are final. Financial decisions we make together. She looked at him. I won't do it if it's your money and my labor and your name on the papers. I've done that for other people and I'm done. Equal, he said. That's what I'm offering. And if it fails, we lose money and we figure out what comes next. He said it plainly. I'm not pretending it's guaranteed. I'm saying I think it's worth the risk, and I think you do too. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her doing the calculation, not the financial one. She'd already done that. But the other one, the harder one, the one about what it meant to trust someone that far, to let them that close to something she'd been building toward her entire working life. What would we call it? She asked. He hadn't thought about that specifically. He thought about it now. Something that says what it is, he said. Not Silver Crest, something without pretension. She was quiet for a moment. The hearth table, she said. He turned it over. Why that? Because a hearth is where the fire is, she said, and a table is where people come together. She looked at the street. It's what I want it to be, not a hotel dining room for people with money to spend, a place where the food is honest and the door is open and people feel like they belong in it. The hearth table, he said. It felt right in the mouth. It felt like something that could be painted on a sign and mean what it said. Yes, she said. They went to see the building the following morning. Coulter had the key from the owner, and they let themselves in and stood in the empty interior with the morning light coming through the gaps in the paper on the windows and falling in long strips across the bare floor. The space was bigger than it looked from outside, deeper, with a good back section that would make a workable kitchen if it was fitted right. The bones of the building were solid. The crack in the front step was cosmetic. Tessa walked the space slowly. She went to the back section and stood in it with her eyes moving over the walls, the ceiling height, the placement of the existing flue. She was doing something in her head that he couldn't follow, building it in advance, the way she planned menus, working through the logic of where everything needed to be. The range goes here, she said to the wall. I'll need a second flue added, and the prep counter needs to run along this wall, full length, with storage underneath. She turned and looked at the main room. 8 tables, maybe 10 if we're careful about the spacing, but 8 is more comfortable. She walked to the front window. I want the window clear, no paper. People should be able to see in. Most places keep the windows covered. Most places are afraid of what people will think if they look in. She peeled a corner of the window paper back and looked at the street. I'm not. He stood watching her and felt something that was close to certainty. A rare and specific feeling, the kind that came not from confidence about the future, but from recognizing something clearly for what it was in the present moment. This was right, not easy, not safe, but right in the way that some things just were, like a river finding its channel, like two people who'd been pointed in the same direction by entirely different roads arriving at the same place. They spent September in preparation. It was more work than either of them had fully anticipated, which they both should have anticipated because that was how preparation always went. There was the renovation, the second flue, the prep counter, the floor that needed leveling in the northeast corner where Frost Heave had introduced a slope that would have driven a precise cook to distraction. There was equipment to source, some purchased new, most purchased used from a supplier in Helena who dealt in restaurant goods and had a range that Tessa declared sound after a 2-hour inspection that the supplier found alarming. There were conversations with the 2 farms she'd been working with at the Silvercrest, negotiating supply agreements. There were conversations with Hatch, which were difficult in the specific way of conversations with men who feel entitled to something they're losing. He'd known she was building towards something like this, he said, and he felt she might have given him more notice, and Tessa listened to all of it with patience and said she was grateful for the opportunity the Silvercrest had given her, and that Pearl was more than capable of running the kitchen until he found a permanent replacement. That last part was what she'd been leading to. Pearl was 18 by then, and the conversation Tessa had with her about the head cook position at the Silvercrest was brief and direct, and left Pearl standing very still in the middle of the kitchen for about 30 seconds before she said yes. "You're leaving me your job," Pearl said. "I'm telling Hatch you can do it. What he does with that is up to him." Tessa looked at her. "But you can do it. You know you can." "I'm 18. I was 23 when I should have had a head cook position and didn't get one because of a different problem. Age is just one of many arbitrary reasons people use to decide things." She handed Pearl the kitchen log. "Don't let anyone take credit for your work. Write everything down." Pearl looked at the log, then at Tessa, with the expression of someone receiving something that contained more weight than it appeared to. "I'll try," she said. "Don't try," Tessa said. "Do it. Trying means you've already made room for not doing it." Pearl blinked, then she nodded. The hearth table opened on a Thursday in early October, which Coulter had thought was a strange choice, opening on a Thursday. And Tessa had said she didn't want to open on a Friday or Saturday when expectations were high and she was still working out the rhythm of the new kitchen. Better to find your feet on a quieter night. Better to be ready when the crowd came than to face the crowd before you were ready. She was right about that too. 8 tables, as she'd planned. The windows clear. The sign above the door painted by a man from town who did lettering and had understood what she wanted after 2 conversations. Clean, readable, no flourishes. The hearth table. The fire in the kitchen range was started at 3 in the afternoon and would not go out thereafter for the better part of the next decade. The opening night was 12 covers. Not full. She'd held the doors to 2 tables as a deliberate choice, wanted space to move, wanted the first service to breathe. The food was the food Tessa Crow cooked when there was no one above her to answer to and nothing between her and the work, which was to say it was extraordinary in the specific, grounded, you-know-it-when-you-eat-it way that has nothing to do with presentation and everything to do with truth. Coulter worked the front that night. He'd known from the beginning that his role was not in the kitchen. That was hers, completely. But out where the people were, where the conversations happened, where the tone got set for what kind of place this was going to be. He greeted people. He talked to them the way he'd learned to talk to people in 12 years of law work, directly, warmly, without performance. He refilled water. He learned that first night that he was reasonably good at this particular version of things, which surprised him in a way he found he liked. A man named Ellery Marsh, a hardware merchant who'd been in town for 2 years and was well-liked, leaned back after his main course and said, "Who's cooking back there?" "Tessa Crow," Coulter said. "She owns the place." "She always cook like this?" "Better some nights," Coulter said. Marsh looked at his plate, looked at Coulter. "I'll be back Friday. We'll have a table for you," Coulter said. He meant it. He'd already decided that a man like Marsh, steady, respected, the kind of person other people followed through doors, was exactly the kind of regular customer that built a place's reputation not through what he said about it, but through the simple visible fact of his presence. At the end of the service, when the last guest had left and the kitchen was being cleaned and the front room was quiet, Tessa came out and sat at one of the tables in her kitchen apron, with her hair loose from its pins and flour on her left forearm that she hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. She looked at the room, the cleared tables, the empty chairs, the street visible through the clear windows with the last light of the October evening on it. Coulter sat down across from her. He put 2 cups of coffee on the table. He'd learned to make coffee in the new kitchen's particular way, which was different from Mrs. Hadley's and would take some getting used to. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "How was the kitchen?" "The range runs hot on the left side. I'll need to compensate until we get someone to look at it." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "The timing on the main course was off by about 3 minutes. I need another set of hands back there." She looked at the window. "The soup was right. The dessert was right. The whole meal was right," he said. "I heard every table." She looked at him. She was exhausted. He could see it, the familiar depth of it. But this was a different kind of tired than the July collapse. This was the tired that came from pouring everything out into something and watching it land the way it was meant to. The tired of a thing done, not a thing failing. "It's going to be hard," she said. "This year is going to be hard. We might not make the rent in January or February when traffic drops. We have reserves for January and February," he said. "We planned for that. People might decide they'd rather eat at the Silver Crest." "Some people will," he said. "And some people will decide they'd rather eat here. And the ones who decide they'd rather eat here will come back and bring someone else. And that's how it builds." She looked at him steadily. He could see her testing the ground, the way she always tested ground before she put her weight on it. "You're not afraid," she said. "I didn't say that." He picked up his cup. "I'm afraid of the January rent. I'm afraid of the range running hot. I'm afraid of a lot of things." He paused. "I'm not afraid of this. Not the core of it." She looked at him. The core of it. The fire in the range, her name on the sign, his presence in the room. The thing they'd been building in plain sight since a frozen camp in the Montana highlands. Neither of them quite willing to call it what it was until the ground was solid enough to hold the weight of the name. She held his gaze, and then she did something she rarely did without reason. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just briefly. Just for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "For the building. For all of it." He turned his hand over and held hers for that moment, and then they both let go, because there was inventory to finish and a range to assess, and the morning would come early, and they were both people who understood that some things didn't need to be rushed, that good things built slowly were the kind that lasted. Outside, through the clear windows, Bozeman went about its evening, loud and growing and full of people who didn't know yet what was on that side street, what was lighting up behind that sign, what was going to be waiting for them when they found it. But they would find it. That much Coulter was certain of. People always found the thing that was real. The January rent got paid. Just barely, and not without 2 weeks of Coulter watching the numbers with the focused attention he'd once applied to tracking men through difficult country. But it got paid, and February was marginally better, and by March of the following year the hearth table had become the kind of place that people in Bozeman mentioned when someone from out of town asked where to eat. Not famous? Not yet. But known, in the specific way that matters more than famous in the early life of a place, known by people who talk to other people, known by the kind of regular customers who made a restaurant feel inhabited rather than visited. Ellery Marsh came back on Fridays, as he'd said he would. A school teacher named Mrs. Voss came every Wednesday with whoever she was currently arguing with about literature, and the arguments were loud and the food got eaten with the distracted intensity of people too engaged in their conversation to fully notice they were enjoying the meal, which Tessa said was the highest compliment a kitchen could receive. A ranching family from the valley started bringing their foreman in on Saturday evenings, a party of 6 or 8 that were loud and ate everything and tipped well when Coulter explained, carefully and without condescension, what tipping was and how it worked. The range got fixed in February by a man Tessa had tracked down through a supplier contact in Helena. The second kitchen hire happened in March. A young man named Thomas who had cooked on a cattle drive and had the particular quality that drive cooking produced, which was the ability to make something edible and sustaining out of nearly nothing, which Tessa valued more than technical training because technical training could be given, but that quality couldn't. She gave him technique. He gave the kitchen a resilience it had lacked. Coulter ran the front and managed the parts of the business that weren't cooking. The accounts, the supplier relationships, The occasional conversation with town officials about zoning or licensing, the specific diplomacy required when a neighbor on the street had a complaint about kitchen smell or delivery hours. He was good at all of it. More than that, he found that he was engaged by it in a way he hadn't been by law work in years. Not the individual moments, which had sometimes been engaging, but the sustained project of building something, the sense of accumulation, of each day's work connecting to the next. He missed the badge occasionally. He missed the clarity of it, the clear line between his authority and the situation, the way law work had a defined structure that civilian life didn't. Running a restaurant involved a different and less clearly defined kind of authority, one that required constant negotiation and couldn't rely on anything external to back it up. He was still learning that in his second year. He expected he'd be learning it for a while. In April, the Silvercrest dining room put a new sign out front announcing expanded hours, which Tessa read as Hatch's response to the hearth table's growing reputation. She mentioned it once and didn't bring it up again. "Doesn't it bother you?" Coulter asked. "Competition means we're worth competing with," she said. "If he wasn't worried, he wouldn't have bothered." "You're not worried?" "I'm always worried," she said. "Worry is different from scared. I worry about the supply from the North Farm if we get another early frost. I worry about Thomas's wrist that he's been favoring all week and hasn't told me about. I worry about whether the dining room chairs are starting to look worn enough that people notice." She looked at him. "The Silvercrest is Hatch's problem to manage. I'm not going to spend what I have on worrying about him." Thomas's wrist turned out to be a minor sprain from a loading accident. She found out because she asked him directly, not in the kitchen, but after service, sitting at a table with him the way she occasionally sat with each member of her staff, just talking, a habit she'd developed and that the kitchen ran better for, because people who felt seen by their employer did better work than people who felt like components. She arranged for him to work lighter for 2 weeks, redistributed tasks without making a production of it, and the wrist healed without becoming a bigger problem. Pearl sent a note in May from the Silvercrest. She'd been running the kitchen for 7 months, and the note was factual and characteristic. She'd introduced 2 new dishes on her own authority. Hatch had tried to override one of them. She'd argued her case with specific data about ingredient cost and customer response, and Hatch had backed down. She wrote it without triumph, just information, and at the end added, "I thought you'd want to know." Tessa read it twice. Then she wrote back, a single page, direct, with specific feedback on the dishes Pearl described. And at the end, "You did it right. Keep going." She showed Coulter the exchange. He read both letters and handed them back without saying much. He didn't need to. The look on her face when she folded Pearl's note and put it away was the kind that didn't need commentary. She was not a woman who accepted the word mentor easily or wore it without discomfort, but she was beginning, reluctantly and exactly, to understand that some part of what she'd built had already begun to replicate itself in another person, and that this was not a diminishment of her own work, but an extension of it. He thought she would become more comfortable with that over time. He was right, though it took longer than he expected. The second year was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because the restaurant had developed enough of a reputation that the expectations were higher, and higher expectations meant the margin for error got narrower. A service that would have been considered good in the first year was now adequate, and adequate wasn't what people were coming for. Easier because by now they both knew what they were doing. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with the fluency that came from having made enough mistakes to stop being surprised by the kind you kept making and to start getting ahead of them. There was a night in October of the second year, almost exactly a year after opening, when a late supplier delivery left them short on the main protein for a full house Friday service. And the 45 minutes between discovering the shortage and the first guests arriving were the kind of 45 minutes that revealed character fast and without mercy. Coulter went to 2 different vendors on foot, while Tessa redesigned the main course around what she had, which required her to restructure the flavor arc of the entire meal backward from what she'd planned, the way you'd reroute a journey when the main road was out. The guests never knew. The service ran long by 12 minutes, which a few people noticed, and one man complained about it to Coulter on his way out, in the particular way of men who complained about things not because it had ruined their evening, but because they felt entitled to have a complaint received. Coulter listened to all of it, acknowledged the wait, offered a genuine apology, and when the man left, went back to the kitchen and told Tessa it had gone fine. He complained, she said. She'd heard the conversation from the kitchen. He ate everything on his plate, Coulter said, and he didn't mean it. He complained because he needed to feel like he mattered. He washed his hands at the sink. He'll be back. The man was back the following Friday. What happened between Coulter and Tessa during those 2 years was not the kind of thing that arrived with an announcement. It was more like a structure that had been under construction for so long that by the time you stood back and looked at it, you realized the building was already done, and you had been living in it for quite a while. They had been living in it. Separately, in rooms they still kept at Mrs. Hadley's because neither of them was a person who moved quickly on things that mattered, and because the restaurant had demanded so much of the first year that there hadn't been space for anything else, and because they were both, though they would have described it differently, somewhat afraid of naming a thing that was working and possibly changing it in the naming. It was Tessa who finally addressed it, which surprised him because she was usually the more careful of the two in matters that weren't work. She brought it up on a Sunday evening in November of the second year. The restaurant closed for the day. The two of them at the kitchen table with the account spread between them and the stove burning against the early winter cold. She put her pen down. She looked at the window. She said, "Are we going to talk about this?" He looked up from the ledger. He knew exactly what she meant. "If you want to," he said. "That's not an answer." "No." He set down his pen. "Yes, I want to talk about it." She looked at him. In 2 years of close work and daily proximity, he had come to know her face the way you knew a landscape you lived in, all its qualities and moods, and the way different lights changed it. Right now she had the expression she wore when she was deciding to say a true thing and making sure she was going to say it accurately. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I've spent most of my adult life either working or moving. I don't have a lot of practice at—" She paused. "At staying somewhere. With someone." "Neither do I," he said. "I know. That's part of why I'm bringing it up." She looked at the table. "I'm not afraid of the feeling. I figured out what the feeling was a long time ago. I'm afraid of what happens to the work if the other thing goes wrong." "The restaurant." "Everything we built," she said. "If we—" She stopped. "I've seen what happens to a business when the people running it stop being able to be in the same room. I don't want that to be this." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what she was actually saying underneath what she was saying, which was, "I've already lost enough things. I can't afford to lose this one." He understood that. He was carrying a version of it himself. Eli on a river gravel bar, the cost of acting too fast, the long project of learning to go slowly with things that mattered. "I can't promise you it won't be hard," he said, "or that we won't have days where we can't be in the same room. That's going to happen regardless." He looked at her. "What I can tell you is that I'm not going anywhere, not from the restaurant, not from the town." He paused. "Not from you, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long time. The stove ticked. The accounts lay between them, the small numbers of a small business that was becoming something real. "That's a careful answer," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said. "You told me that yourself." She looked at him and the small, real smile came, and this time it stayed longer than usual. "Yes," she said, "I did." They married in the spring in a ceremony that was short and attended by the people they actually knew. Mrs. Hadley, who cried in a contained way that suggested she'd been expecting it for some time. Ellery Marsh and his wife. Thomas and the rest of the kitchen staff. Marshall Flood, who came in his good coat and shook Coulter's hand with the grip of a man approving of a thing he'd been watching develop at a distance. Pearl came down from the Silver Crest on her day off, wearing a dress she'd borrowed from someone and looking at Tessa through the whole of the short ceremony with an expression that was too complex to fully read, but contained, somewhere in it, the specific gratitude of a person whose life had bent in a better direction because of someone else's stubbornness. There was no ceremony beyond the ceremony. They went back to the restaurant afterward and Tessa cooked, which everyone had known she would, and the meal was the kind that people talked about for years afterward, without being able to fully describe what had made it exceptional. Only that it had been, and that they'd been there, and that they'd known even in the middle of it that they were in the middle of something they'd remember. The third year was the year the hearth table became, by any practical measure, the most beloved place to eat in the Gallatin Valley. Not the most expensive, not the most fashionable, the most loved, which is a different category and a more durable one. The distinction mattered, and Tessa understood it clearly. Fashionable restaurants were targets for replacement. Beloved ones became part of a place's idea of itself. She expanded the kitchen that spring, adding 2 stations and hiring a third cook, a woman named Ruth who'd been cooking for a mining camp for 2 years and had the kind of raw ability that camp cooking either killed or forged into something extraordinary, and in Ruth's case had done the latter. She was 24 and confident in a way that sometimes veered into arrogance, and Tessa managed that with the particular patience of someone who recognized in another person a version of something she'd once had to manage in herself. "She reminds you of yourself," Coulter said. "She reminds me of myself when I was wrong about the things I was right about," Tessa said. "There's a difference." He laughed, and she looked at him with that expression she'd always had and always would have, the one that was trying not to be amused and not quite succeeding. The reputation brought other things besides customers. In the fall of the 3rd year, a man came to the hearth table from Denver, a restaurant developer, he said, representing interests that were looking at opening quality dining establishments in the growing Western territories. He wanted to talk to Tessa about the possibility of a partnership, about opening a second location, about her becoming a name rather than a place. She listened to all of it over a 2-hour dinner that Coulter sat in on at her request. The man was polished and specific, and the money he described was real and considerable. When he left, she sat at the table for a moment. "Well," Coulter said. "No," she said. "Just no? What he's offering is my name on something he controls." She looked at the door the man had gone through. "I've spent my whole working life building toward having a thing that was mine, completely mine. He's offering to buy the name and leave me the feeling that I still own it, and I don't think he understands that I can tell the difference." She picked up her cup. "The answer is no." He'd known that before she said it. He'd known it the same way he'd known, on a mountainside in November, that the smoke he smelled meant something worth following, some things you just knew. The 4th year brought a young cook named Daniel, who was 17 and had been sent to the hearth table by his mother, who had heard that the woman running it would be honest with him about whether he had any ability. Tessa spent one afternoon with him in the kitchen and told him that he had some instinct and no technique, and that one without the other was not enough, and that if he was willing to start at the bottom of the bottom and work up without complaint, she'd teach him. He started at the bottom of the bottom. He didn't complain. By the time he was 20, he was one of the best young cooks in the territory, and he'd learned something else alongside the cooking. He'd learned, by watching Tessa and Coulter, what it looked like when 2 people built something together without either of them disappearing into it. He said this once, toward the end of his 4th year at the hearth table, sitting in the kitchen after a late service. He was 21 and had started saying true things out loud, which was a development that happened to people who spent time around Tessa Crow. "You two never fight about the restaurant," he said. "Other places I've worked, the owners are always—" He made a gesture. "But you don't." Tessa looked up from the inventory she was doing. "We fight about the restaurant constantly," she said. "Not like that." He tried to find the words. "You fight about what's right for it, not what's right for you." Coulter, who was on the other side of the kitchen checking a repair to one of the station edges, didn't say anything. Tessa went back to the inventory. "That's a hard thing to do," Daniel said. "Yes," Tessa said. "It is." What she didn't say, because she wasn't in the habit of explaining things that people needed to learn for themselves, was that you didn't arrive at it by intention. You arrived at it by building something together that you cared about more than you cared about being right, and then by testing that priority over and over until it became the foundation rather than the aspiration. It took years, and it took specific people, and it was not available to everyone because not everyone was willing to let the thing they'd built matter more than their pride in having built it. She'd learned that. It had taken her longer than she'd like. Coulter had taught her some of it, and she'd taught him some of it, and the rest they'd learned from the restaurant itself, which was, like all businesses built by hand, a relentless and unsentimental teacher. The years accumulated. Pearl eventually left the Silvercrest and opened her own place. A smaller room, 3 streets over, breakfast and lunch only, her handwriting on the sign. She came to Tessa before she signed the lease. Tessa told her to sign it, told her to read every line first, told her to negotiate the repair clause because landlords in growing towns always push the repair clause. Pearl signed the lease. Ruth became Tessa's head cook at the hearth table. The position defined exactly the way Tessa had once defined her ambitions to a half-frozen deputy in a mountain camp. Her menu, her decisions, her kitchen. Ruth ran it with the confidence that had been alloyed over years into something more useful than raw certainty, and she trained people in the way she'd been trained, which was honestly and without ceremony, and with the understanding that the kitchen worked because everyone in it understood what they were there for. Daniel left eventually, too. He went south to a town in Wyoming that was growing fast and needed someone who knew what they were doing. He wrote a letter to Tessa before he left, and another one 6 months after he'd arrived. In the second one, he said, "The mayor here tried to take credit for something I did. I remembered what you told Pearl. I had it written down. It worked." She wrote back, "Good. Keep going." The restaurant expanded once in the 7th year, not in size, but in hours, adding a Sunday midday service that became something specific to the hearth table, something that couldn't have been planned and that emerged from the character of the place and the town. Sunday midday became the service that people brought people they wanted to show the town to. Family visiting from the east, business partners from elsewhere, people being courted for something or celebrated for something or consoled for something. It became the service where the room was loudest and the food was, paradoxically, the most careful, because Tessa understood by then that the midday crowd was bringing the hearth table as an argument. Look at what this place has. Look at what we built here. And she intended to be worthy of the argument. One Sunday evening, after the midday service had cleared and the kitchen was closed and the room was quiet with the specific piece of a space that had been used well, Coulter sat at the table nearest the window and looked at the street. Tessa came out from the kitchen and sat across from him. She had a cup of tea and she looked tired the way she always looked tired after a Sunday. Not depleted, but spent, like something had been fully used and would be full again by morning. He looked at her. She looked at the street. The light was the long, flat light of a fall afternoon, everything amber and still. "It worked," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "What you came here to do." He nodded at the room, the windows, the street beyond. "It worked." She looked at the room for a moment. The tables, the chairs worn at the edges with use, the window clear as she'd said she wanted it, the street visible and the people on it. She'd been looking at this room for 7 years and she was still not entirely accustomed to it, to the fact of it, to the reality that something she'd once only carried in her head as a kind of defiant private ambition was now a physical fact in the world that strangers walked past and recognized and felt something about. "It's working," she said. The present tense, not the past, because she was not a woman who treated a thing as finished when it was still alive. He smiled. She saw him smile and she smiled back. Not the small, quick smile she'd always had, but a fuller one, the kind that came from the same place that the other one came from, but had more room now, more room for things. "What do you think about," she asked, "when you're sitting out here?" He thought about it honestly, the way he'd learned to think about her questions. He thought about a mountain slope and wood smoke and a woman sitting by a fire who had looked at him like he was a problem to assess and fed him anyway. He thought about Eli, about the river, about the long, complicated shape of guilt, and how it didn't leave but became, over time, a different weight to carry. Lighter in some seasons, heavier in others, but always there, always his. He thought about what it meant to stop running and find that what you'd been running toward had been in one place all along, waiting for you to slow down enough to see it. "Eli sometimes," he said. "The old work, the mountains." He looked at her. "Mostly whatever's in front of me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way she had on opening night, but she didn't take it back this time. "Good," she said. "This is what it comes down to. When you look at a life from the far end of it, or from the far side of someone else's, the things that matter almost never arrive the way you expected them to. They come through back routes, through accidents and detours, through the particular grace of a door you didn't intend to walk through opening at the right moment. A man follows wood smoke down a mountain because he's cold and hungry and out of options. A woman feeds a stranger because she has enough, and because turning away someone in that condition is not the kind of person she intends to be. Neither of them is looking for what they find. But here is what Tessa Crowe understood, and what she lived, and what she passed on without lectures or declarations. The things worth having in this life require you to be someone specific before you can receive them. Not perfect, not lucky. Specific. forged into a particular shape by the particular pressure of your particular losses and your particular refusal to let those losses determine your limits. She had been told, by kitchens and by men, and by the slow grinding machinery of a world that decided what people were worth before looking at them, that she was less than what she was. She had refused that assessment for so long, and with such consistency that the refusal had become structural. The way her kitchen ran, the way she treated the people who worked for her, the way she stood in a doorway and held her ground, the way she handed Pearl a kitchen log and said, "Don't let anyone take credit for your work. Write everything down." And Coulter, who had spent years chasing men through difficult country without fully understanding that what he was running from was the fear of arriving somewhere that required him to stay, had been stopped not by exhaustion or failure, but by something simpler and harder, a chance to build something real with someone real, and the courage, slow developing and imperfect, to take it. Neither of them became famous. Bozeman was not a city that produced national legends, and the Hearth Table was not that kind of place. What it was over the years was something rarer, a place that people pointed to when they wanted to explain what the town was, what it valued, what it could do with itself when it decided to try. A place where the food was honest because the person who made it had paid in full for her right to define what honest meant. A place where the door was open and the window was clear, and you were judged by what you brought to the table and nothing else. They grew old in it, neither of them gracefully. Tessa with the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to accept that age changed what she was capable of, until her body made the argument undeniably, and Coulter with the quieter stubbornness of a man who kept the accounts and the relationships long after most men his age had handed such things to younger people because he'd been useful his whole life and didn't know how to stop being so. They had arguments that lasted 3 days and resolutions that lasted 3 minutes. They had seasons when everything worked and seasons when nothing did. They had the ordinary texture of a long life shared closely, which is not romantic and not dull, but something in between that only looks beautiful from a distance. What they had, at the end, was what they'd built. And what they'd built outlasted them, because the people they'd trained carried it forward. Pearl in her breakfast room, Ruth in the Hearth Table kitchen, Daniel in Wyoming and then further south, and all the others who'd learned not just technique, but something harder to name. That a kitchen run with honesty and fairness and the genuine desire to feed people well was worth more than a kitchen run with ambition alone, and that the people who worked in it deserved to be seen, and that the person running it set the terms for all of that by who they were willing to be. The Hearth Table ran for 23 years under Tessa's hand. The sign above the door, repainted twice, always said the same thing in the same clean letters. The windows were always clear. The deputy who had stumbled out of the Montana highlands half dead and starving, who had followed wood smoke because it was the only option left, had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. He'd found a purpose that outlived the badge, and a home that wasn't defined by 4 walls, and a woman who had changed the shape of his future by the simple act of feeding him soup and telling him not to argue about it, and the frontier cook who had been told she would never belong, who had carried her talent and her stubbornness and her refusal across more difficult country than any mountain range she'd ever crossed, had proven the only thing worth proving, that she had been right about herself all along, that the world had simply needed time to catch up. They had not been lucky. They had not been exceptional in the way that exceptional is usually described. No single moment of triumph, no great dramatic turn. What they had been was stubborn and honest, and in the specific and undervalued way of people who refuse to let failure be the final word, relentlessly, quietly, enduringly willing to keep going. That willingness, carried long enough, builds a life. Sometimes it builds something that outlives you.